small businesses are the competition. They are innovation. They define neighborhoods. They create opportunity. They're part of the American dream. Small businesses were too big to fail is what I like to say. And entrepreneurs really take us into a new world where we need leadership to create economic growth. The potential benefits to the U.S. and its citizens, that's where government should step in whenever it's necessary to make sure that those great folks with ideas can actually survive and build their company and deliver that technology or that innovation. The charge is to continue to make sure that entrepreneurs have affordable capital and pathways to success, because we need them to create jobs and deliver for our communities.
Isabel, I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. And I think I'm starting to lose count on how many episodes we've done. I'm both losing count on both the episode and the look that we have for our space, because that's kind of the fun thing that we do. And when people eventually see this, all this content on whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, they'll see the evolution of the space. But every time I walk in here, it looks more and more awesome. So I'm excited about doing this with you. And I know we've been chatting about having this conversation, and I couldn't be more excited to have a discussion with you. Look, as a starting point, I was reading in your bio that part of your roots, it started with some of the work that you were doing with your dad. And he had, was it a chain of veterinary clinics that he worked on? Tell me a little bit about that, and how old were you? What were you doing with them? And I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, veterinary medicine was his journey to California. In fact, he's after vet school, decided to come to California and pursue his California dream and starting a business in veterinary medicine. And from a young age, I was 1 year old when he started his first practice in East LA. And from that point on, that was his life, just building this chain of veterinary hospitals, multiple locations on the east side. And I worked with him as much as I could. I loved going in with my dad and seeing him engage with people. Everyone knew who he was, and just were seeking his help and guidance. And I eventually started working there, those weekends and summer breaks and fall breaks, etc. And I learned quite a bit from my dad. He was very influential in those days on me and helping me understand what a small business owner is.
I mean, you got it like from the source. I mean, you got to see a business get built from the beginning, and probably see both that impact that it has, not just as a business, but also the impact that it has on the families, right? But I think part of the reason why obviously I wanted to talk to you is, and I wanted to hear more from you, is so you were the 27th administrator for the Small Business Administration for the SBA. This was right for the Biden administration, right, in 2020?
21, all the way through, yes.
Yes, and you had a couple of different roles. I had here also you were the Deputy Chief of Staff, I guess that was before that, for the Obama and Biden administration, in the California Office of Small Business as well, right?
Correct, yes.
So you've been at the heart of, which I think this is actually when we were talking, we were prepping for this conversation. To me, the big theme to talk to you about, which I want to kind of get into, is this idea of the role of government and the role both that it plays and should play as it relates to entrepreneurship, as it relates to innovation, as it relates to economic growth. And you've seen it firsthand. So I would love you to just tell me about it. Like when you go back and think about the different roles that you had within the government and leading up to being administrator of the SBA. Maybe talk to me a little bit what that experience was like, and seeing firsthand the role that the government could play and should be playing in turn trying to be able to spur economic activity.
Yeah, well, from a really young age, I've always loved government and policy and understanding how it impacts the economy, our communities. My dad, I say he gave me my influence of understanding small business, entrepreneurship. But my mom, she was the advocate. She was that mama bear that went in and advocated on behalf of her children in schools to make sure that we had opportunity and access. And gave me that passion to speak up for the underdog in many cases. And that's what I was interested in leveraging government for. How can we help advance society for everybody with that advocacy role? And for me, government, this is the greatest democracy ever. A democracy will deliver certainty and stability in its rules and its laws to be able to encourage that free marketplace. And I'm really I was interested in business always, but as well government and its role. And throughout any industry or any program, you see government and its influence, whether that is just in regulatory or oversight capacity or in a gap filler. And in the case of small business and entrepreneurship, our country has always been quite aggressive in wanting to encourage entrepreneurship. It is, for me, one of the key parts of the American dream, that ability to lift up your family through entrepreneurship, your hard work, your effort. And so, in the case of entrepreneurship, government steps in to fill gaps in the marketplace so that we can seed these very young and new small businesses to become and grow and scale. All these large businesses started small, and even in the case of the federal government programs and small businesses, Qualcomm in its early days got a grant from the federal government through the SBA's powered programs. Tesla got investments through one of SBA's important programs, and Jenny's Ice Cream, Chobani Yogurt, Sweetgreens, all of these companies and various programs were able to better access the marketplace through government interventions. And so, yes, it's a free market, but we also know that there are sometimes barriers or challenges, and government wants to incentivize where we see opportunity for people. And small businesses create 2/3 of net new jobs. You want them to be successful.
100%.
That's what is giving everybody their American dream, whether it's a job or a small business.
And in those cases, did you see that the primary function was access to capital in terms of supporting some of those small business? Because you kind of point to, and I think there are very different types of industry or companies that you just mentioned. And I always think about, yes, there is access to capital, like SBA loans, literally, right, to do that. But then the other one is all the investment that is done through grants for institutions of research, and how much of that investment ultimately leads to creating the kind of environment for some of these startups to really thrive and evolve, right? And we tend to not think about that because they're almost like the romanticized version of entrepreneurship, and like, no, we did it all ourselves. We someone had an idea in their garage and they just did the entire thing, and then these are the people that just made it all happen. But along the way, people kind of tend to forget all of the sort of touch points of where some of these, whether it be grants, loans, investments in infrastructure, actually create the environment for some of these companies to be able to thrive.
Yeah. Well, in small businesses or the startup innovators in technology or science-based fields, all of them, will face these barriers to entry, including capital. They can't get the low cost of capital that a large company can. So, being able to get creative and rely on whatever grants or, incentives that they can get is really part of their job as an entrepreneur, to really to make their business model more resilient, especially. So, but it's across the board. It's resources that the government invests in innovation, the R&D, all of those investments pay off in seeding companies, whether that's a startup that was part of developing that R&D, or that they take off the shelf and commercialize and make it into a company, whatever the case may be. I think it's important that those investments in R&D and research and commercialization are what's really helping us in our leadership across multiple industries. Whether it's AI or biotech or ag tech, we want to lead in these fields for our economy as well as our national security. And so when we think of the potential benefits to the U.S. and its citizens, that's where government should step in whenever it's necessary, to make sure that those great folks with ideas can actually survive and build their company and deliver that technology or that innovation.
And as part of some of those programs, including the SBA, was there any coordination, communication of how to think about what gets funded, especially with the private markets, right? Because when I think about maybe more tech-driven startups, right? You think about the rounds that people go to, friends and family, then you get into angel investors, then you get into private equity or venture funds, and then eventually private equity. Yet, when you look at the broader data of who's actually getting funded, it still seems to be the same kind of folks, for the most part, getting funded. It's still a big group of people that just have a harder time raising capital. You saw, actually, maybe coming off of some of these efforts around what happened in some of the efforts, I think, from the Biden administration, is a lot more of these institutions where you saw a lot more maybe funds that were more tailored towards more multicultural investors. But is there a coordination may be the wrong word, but communication between the private and public sector to say, hey, if we think about what are the right industries and right areas and types of business to be funded, how do we align and coordinate to make sure that these entrepreneurs, these small businesses, are getting the right support at every stage so that they get a shot to actually grow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the challenge. I would say it is a marketplace that you're able to compete in. There's you take great risks, and there's great rewards too as well. So obviously, there's natural competition that we want to have in our economy. Government and public policy really looks at where can we make investments to seed further growth in the economy, either leadership in an industry that's important to national security, or leadership in an industry where there's heavy job creation or a big force multiplier in the economy. So it's true. I mean, if you look at government programs for small business, they're funding programs that help with trade, that help small businesses do trade abroad, because those people probably, the data shows that they create higher paying jobs and that they're more resilient because they're entering into multiple marketplaces. There are programs that support innovation through investment vehicles, through R&D and grants. And that's because in the technology sector, there's a force multiplier, at least a 5x to 7x multiplier of job creation in technology and science fields versus your typical Main Street retail, food, et cetera. And so that's where you see government step in, where we need leadership to create economic growth and prosperity. And so I think those are the decisions that are being made when laws are enacted to decide to fund things. But I do think at its essence, small businesses are the competition. They are innovation. They define neighborhoods. They create opportunity. They're part of the American dream. And so, just by essence, they're important. They're so important. 40% of GDP, half of the private workforce. And so, but you want to be able to have that risk-reward system in place, so government's not going to step in and control everything, but incentivize where we want growth. And where I think that what's important is that you want there to be healthy entrepreneurship. And what we were seeing is that women and people of color were starting businesses at the highest rates. They have been for the last 10 years. They're just highly entrepreneurial, pursuing that risk and those opportunities. And yet they're the ones who face tremendous barriers. So how do you remove those barriers in society so that our economy can excel and grow? If the very people starting businesses that we're relying on for job creation can't grow because their costs of capital are too high, or they can't get investors, then that's a problem for our economy. And so, we were really thinking about ensuring that there were no barriers that were, prescribed through the marketplace that that would limit.
And that's like on a regular cycle. But you had a very peculiar and interesting period of our history, which was coming right out of COVID. So. Yeah, talk to me about that. As an administrator of the SBA, maybe rewind the clock a little bit. Tell me what it was like getting appointed for this and taking on this massive responsibility at a moment where the economy was in a really tricky point, where it needed to be injected with some capital, where there was a lot of people whose businesses were at risk of potentially going away. And as a government, trying to figure out what that right balance was of how do you inject that energy that the economy needed, and responding sort of right to the moment. So maybe take a step back and just rewind it. I mean, we were just joking, right? I was telling you that I was watching the series Drive to Survive, and I think I'm on season 3, and it's all during the 2020, and it's just it's so wild to see this. It's so wild how quickly it turned and how it went. Where business as usual to all of a sudden it was things shut down and then everything, stay home and all this stuff. So how was it for you as in this role with this massive responsibility to navigate that time?
It was such an incredible time, and I went from being in California leading on small business for Governor Newsom during the pandemic to leading the SBA. And I think it was...
When did you start in leading the SBA?
In March of 2021, I was confirmed by the Senate.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And that's when, I took my position. I was nominated, back in December by the President-elect Biden. But it was really a remarkable time because SBA, this little agency that definitely punches outside its weight class. It supports about $50 billion in capital every year. It has typically on average about $100 billion portfolio that it manages. But during the pandemic, there was $1.2 trillion in relief that was pushed out.
Right.
And I think people forget that it was 2 administrations. Obviously, with SBA as well. The COVID pandemic happened in 2020. I came in 2021, so inherited some of these programs, but was responsible for the entire portfolio in terms of forgiveness of loans and administering these programs.
But and that was primarily through the form of the PPP loan.
PPP loan was the majority of
which
it.
Was
almost
separate than like the
billion.
stimulus checks that were
separate than that, which that seeded a lot of entrepreneurship. Actually, some of the stimulus
100%.
check receivers started their businesses.
Yeah, I know people that were like that. Yeah, for sure.
So, so that as well as COVID EIDL loans, grant programs. We had multiple programs launched nationally at scale. Shuttered venues for the entertainment industry, and really these were remarkable because the government stepped in to support small businesses in a way that hadn't been done before. I mean, this is, small businesses were too big to fail, is what I like to say. And, being able to ensure that competition, those neighborhoods were saved by saving our small businesses was something our country took seriously. And then, I think building on that, though, managing that massive portfolio was a huge change. But it also presented an incredible opportunity. I mean, you never let a disaster go to waste, they say. I mean, and that means like stepping in and figuring out, well, now that we have this incredible scale, that we're being forced to rethink everything.
How did you even handle that? Because I mean, to go, that's a step change, right? We say 50 billion to 1.2 trillion.
Right.
I mean, the level of scale associated with that. So
massive.
Maybe talk a little bit about what was that process you kind of went through in figuring out how we're going to deploy this capital? How do we process just the number of applications and look at the number of businesses at a speed that could make an impact? Because if you take too long, those folks are on a timer. Yeah. And if you take too long, they may not be around, right, to still benefit from this. So what was the approach that you sort of took?
Yeah, and more than half the loans were administered under Biden, and all were forgiven under Biden. And so it was a sizable amount, even though we stepped in. But it had to be it was a full course correction. We had already scaled. Massive amounts of money went out the door, but speed was the only focus.
So by the time you came in, of that 1.2 trillion, how much of that had already been deployed?
It was about just about 500 billion.
Yeah.
And the challenge was it was with speed, not speed and certainty. And so the certainty is the fraud conversation, who was checking to make sure the money was going into the hands of those it was intended to serve. And so, there's no next day quarterbacking on this one. This was an emergency. This was unprecedented scale. But what we had to do was course correct and start administering programs with not only speed, but certainty at scale. And so
what were some of the things that you did to create that certainty?
Yeah, what we focused on was how do we invest in technology and then leverage that technology to forever change SBA's programs to better perform for small businesses. And so it was an enormous opportunity to just rethink how we treat our customer experience, leverage technology, and deploy broader networks to better reach all Americans who want to start and grow their businesses.
And is there some of that tech that has sort of remained and now has changed the way that SBAs are, sort of the loans are deployed and how it's managed?
On the lending front, yes, 100%. We invested heavily in technology. SBA is a direct lender as well as, works, with community lenders. And so it was such an honor to be able to lead at that moment because it meant coming in with the vision, course correcting, shifting the whole focus of the organization to follow and build something really spectacular for the SBA and for the federal government to be able to build on into the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously like there was during the time because you always hear the anecdotes of fraud here or there. How much of that was really part of what you were seeing in reality, and versus what whatever the headlines may be? And what were some of the things that you guys were looking at and trying to like course correct? You keep on talking about the course correction.
To me, it's such an important topic, I think, in our democracy is really the civic know-how and the financial know-how to really understand government programs and appreciate their impact, because I do think the fraud has been overstated, by a lot.
Was there a measured amount that was?
There was.
Reported on?
We went through in this 4-point analysis of fraud in order to forgive, of course, and in order to administer the loans and refer to the law enforcement to collect. We collected billions. We thwarted fraud. And implemented systems to forever better protect the programs. But 80% of the fraud did happen in those early months in 2020. And then in addition, a significant amount of it, when you really look at it and then analyze it, it was only about $37 billion, which was still a huge amount.
Right.
But of
So like
$1.2 trillion,
Sure.
it was really more at a private sector best practice. And I think that's what
was there
the
any
story
certain
is more than anything.
industries that were more prone to have some of these issues?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think there were various rings and operators going after these loans, and they're still enforcing and going after these dollars.
And obviously, from a tech standpoint, you mentioned there was a halo effect that sort of happened after the fact. What about from policy itself? What were some of the policy changes that were put in place from that time that have had that kind of lasting effect?
Well, I think this is what happens in the U.S. with change of administrations. There's different priorities. There's been a shift in this current administration away from the policies that we had deployed. We were focused on access to capital, opening up opportunity for small dollar loans, for those startups, for people trying to acquire businesses, transition businesses. The administration has worked hard to reverse those programs and lean more towards larger dollar, which is important, of course, for our manufacturing base, but takes away from some of the small dollar programs we incentivize. But I still think there are gaps in the marketplace that private sector actors are trying to fill, in local and state governments. And I think that's the charge, is to continue to make sure that entrepreneurs have affordable capital and pathways to success, because we need them to create jobs and deliver for our communities.
I think to your point, I thought I saw a stat recently that I think it was like 80%, or a really high number of like new business growth were done by Latinos, and Latinas are like the biggest driving sector of that.
That's right.
Which is a huge opportunity, obviously, in terms of what, where that growth is going to come from, and how all of these small businesses, which, by the way, I actually hate the term small business, to be honest. And the reason I do is because I feel like too many times people kind of limit themselves and calling, like when I say something small business, like startups don't call themselves small business, they call themselves startups. They can have literally no employees and have nothing, and yet they already feel bigger, right? So that's the reason why I don't actually love calling them small business, but that may be my own battle.
Well, I think they sometimes identify, like, I'm a restaurant, I'm a local restaurant, I'm a retailer, I'm an e-commerce vendor. I think they self-identify in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's part of it. No, but I think there's been obviously a lot of halo associated with that. And even when we think about sort of the fraud conversation, it does remind me of everything that recently happened around Doge and all of the fraud that was going to be uncovered, which turned out to be, in my mind, a lot more of where there is investment or spend that we don't agree with, but that's not the same thing as fraud.
Correct. Right. Right. Yeah.
Right. And that seemed to be the bulk of what was sort of cut back on, is areas of investment that this administration didn't necessarily agree with was being invested on, which is once again different than actually committing fraud. Right.
And I think the SB, all federal government has ways to characterize this. It's either straight fraud. It's maybe misappropriated dollars in terms of somebody may not have been eligible for a program, but they applied unknowingly. I mean, sometimes these are honest mistakes. And so there's some of that, but I think for the most part, a lot of the fraud that they thought they'd uncover was just not there. SBA was a big target, big numbers were thrown out. It was the same fraud that was already identified and referred to the law enforcement efforts. And I think, it was a pandemic, one and done, but this course correction is in place, and I think we can rest assured that there's still a reason to invest in entrepreneurs, and I hope to see the federal government continue to do it.
So speaking of what the federal government is doing or not doing, and the current environment, maybe talk to me a little bit about as you see an environment with obviously tariffs and what's happening there, what's your perspective of kind of where we are as a time for small business to thrive, and maybe speak to maybe some of the things that are currently happening, including things like tariffs, and potentially even some of the DOGE cuts that have occurred, and what that does for the actual economic viability of small business in general, and some of the things that you're sort of looking at.
Yeah. Well, I do think that some of the biggest challenges in the current environment for small businesses is the uncertainty related to trade policy and tariffs. I mean, obviously, it's a tool, a policy tool that can be deployed to be able to advance U.S. interests, of course. But the uncertainty, the lack of a level playing field in some instances that we've seen really hurts small businesses, and especially them. They can't navigate and advocate on their behalf in many cases to have an exemption or get any type of specialized treatment. And it's hard enough for them to even think about trading abroad. The costs involved in them trying to enter a market are exorbitant for them. So I think that it has a chilling effect. We want our businesses to trade and be global, but this is intimidating because it's already a costly thing. And certainty is what all businesses try to get, and as they make decisions to move forward. And so that's been a real challenge. The other around the cuts that's really set back some communities in particular. I mean, the cuts at the National Institutes of Health is going to impact R&D and future commercialization. That's startups who are trying to figure out how to make us all more healthy. And I do think that has a negative chilling effect on startups, on innovation, where small businesses really thrive.
Yeah, it's tough to navigate, right, when you're not sure what your cost is for your inventory is going to be at any given moment. That has to be very, very challenging, right? Who do you think are the winners in all this?
Well, it remains to be seen because there's still uncertainty, but clearly you've seen that small businesses have been the least able to navigate this, absorb the cost, or just manage through it. And I do think it's been difficult to determine as well because there's been so much fluctuations, just constant changes in what the plan is, and so. I think it remains to be seen. We'll understand, but you can see it globally. I mentioned before that I'm chairing this global risk index. There's leaders across the world, some from Latin America, Europe, Asia, and truly you recognize that there's just a change in dynamics in how they want to approach doing business with the U.S. It makes it more difficult.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about this organization. So what is this index? What makes it up? Who are the players? Kind of what industry? What are some of the stuff that you guys are looking at in terms of putting out? Is it more like a think tank that comes out with sort of quarterly reports that sort of shares what is the current risk analysis within individual industries, countries?
Well, when I left the administration, when I left federal government, I wanted to retreat and just sort of reflect on what I wanted to do next, but I knew it was going to stay in the space of small business entrepreneurship. I launched Avenida Advisors as a strategic advisory and consulting to think through these issues, not only business growth, but also community economic resilience, and working with government, philanthropy, nonprofits, businesses, to try to advance either business goals or economic goals. And so it's been really interesting to work on some fun projects here back in Los Angeles. And, I know that one of the things that I was interested in engaging in conversations with a global perspective still as well. So one of my clients has created this global reputational risk index to assess where from a brand perspective, from an executive perspective, where there are potential reputational risks in guiding your business. I think more and more those risks are increasing, whether that's disinformation, AI, deep fakes, or risks of political affiliation, with whether that's Elon Musk or Trump or whomever. All of those decisions that are being made by companies potentially have reputation risks down the line. And so it's really trying to assess where the highest reputational risks are for your company in a marketplace and how to manage to those risks. And I think that's really interesting, especially from an entrepreneurial or small business perspective. Those are not the immediate risks at hand that you're thinking about, but they can be so critical for your company.
You worry about paying the rent when you're a small business, right? And making payroll, probably.
Yeah. But it is, because as you're looking to adopt AI, for example, we find that there is increased risk of AI adoption if you're not thinking through the impact on your customers. Some customers, they can be easily frustrated with that chatbot and want a live person. And so how are you, building into all your strategies around technology investments a consideration of what it does to your brand and your reputation?
And how are you going about measuring that? Like, what's the actual process for providing this? And is this being done like for individual clients, or are you doing it as an industry?
We're doing it as a public, global reputation risk index, but the analysis is done, by assessing media stories, finding out where, where trends and views are headed. And trying to put it together in a data set. It's something that the firm found that the federal government did previously, of course, and still does when they're entering into markets. They'll look at reputation risks, for military, et cetera. And so, sort of applying that to the private sector. We should be looking at data to inform us about these reputational risks that are
What have been maybe some insights that have come out that are maybe not as obvious, right? Obviously, terrorism becomes one. What is the the global political or the political environment in any given country obviously has an impact in industries. There are companies that are based out of there, but what's like a non-obvious one that you've already sort of started to see, or at least maybe it's part of the internal conversation that you guys are measuring?
Well, I do think what's interesting is that while we're in this environment of reduced, presumably reduced regulation, at least from the government, there is still an interest and a demand for corporate responsibility, and that sort of guided. Those guided opportunities to make sure that you're being a good citizen as a corporation. So I think that consumers are still holding companies to account.
Do you feel that's a really interesting one, because that was one when you look at the Biden administration and then now the Trump administration, it has seemed like there's a pendulum swing that obviously happens, right? And we had, after everything happened around George Floyd and all of the protests that came from that, there seemed that there's really big push across the board of companies taking a more active stance, and whether it's their D&I, whether it's an investing with corporate and social responsibility, ERGs. There was like all this focus on equity, equality, social responsibility as from a company perspective. But the trend seems to be more the opposite in terms of companies really moving away from it, right? And some of them have paid the price, I think. Think about someone like Target, right? There was like at one point there was like an active conversation on social. People were very upset around some of their efforts moving away from D&I, and it just seems like that's the kind of the broader trend. Are you seeing something different that may be what the headlines are, maybe what some corporate boardrooms are doing, but consumers still want this, need this, are demanding that? Or is part of like their value sort of decision making? I
mean, clearly the issue has torn the country in half,
100%.
literally.
Literally.
And but I do think as these companies are looking at their mission, their values, their marketplace goals in the long term, they have to make that personal assessment. I think so. It's really more of consumers holding folks accountable to what their image and brand has been cultivated to represent. And I think with the Target case, they had represented something quite differently and did such a about face that
it was such a core part of the strategy. Sincere. I mean, I would say even because it wasn't just like they really focused on, because I remember seeing something in their stores that they had like really featuring small business as part of their store. I remember seeing something around American community. Very prevalent within the stores. Obviously, it was a lot of controversy that they went through with some of their Pride Month celebrations, and they got a lot of heat from more the right there. But they seem pretty all in investing in these communities and creating, even leveraging their stores as an access point for some of these smaller business. And I think it was the moving away from that seemed like pretty counter to at least how they've been operating.
Right. And I think it's that. It's approaching with moderation, but more
Yeah.
aligning with your mission and values. And I think
Sure.
corporate responsibility is more than just DEI as well.
Sure.
It's your stewardship of the environment. It's it's your behaviors in the marketplace. Period. You have predatory practices. Like maybe the regulators aren't going to be there to enforce anything, but consumers will judge you poorly and. For any types of misbehaviors or perceived misbehaviors in the marketplace. And I think that's what's surprising.
I actually feel bad, when I would meet some of these folks that had these D&I roles, because it felt, at least for some organizations, the moment they hired this one person, it's like we're done. Like they are responsible for everything, and we got a D&I person, so we're good, right? And it didn't really feel like an authentic commitment or investment in those communities. And I think ultimately that comes across to your consumers.
Yeah, I think
and it also becomes like when times are a little bit tricky, that all of a sudden that role is not that important, and then we very slowly or quietly marginalize that person in the organization. I think that's where it feels like that's part of the challenge, part of the
but it is core to authenticity, and I think leading with authenticity is really important, and staying true to your values, and I think people can pick up on that.
Yeah, for sure.
It can only, communications or campaigns can only go so far to hide it. Like you really have to have that, strong vision and corporate culture cultivated, to provide a good foundation for whatever you might weather.
And on the risk index side, are you also looking at things like social brand presence, the way that the brand is communicated to consumers? I mean, I was just. There was all this controversy with this, I'm forgetting the name of her, the actress who did the Jean commercial, you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yes.
Like Good Jeans, whatever it was, right? And then there was a new one that just came out that had, it's like some Cat's Eye, I think is the name of the group. And they do this whole little dance, and like the song that was pretty popular back in the day, like a milkshake song. And it's like the counter of that. And it just, like some of it seems a little silly, but it does at least take up quite of the conversation, right? It becomes like it becomes an issue that people kind of want to draw the line on and be on both sides. Are you guys looking at things like that, including their marketing, not just sort of elements about that operation?
Yeah, and I mean, and to be clear, this quarterly global reputational risk index is assessing just trends in the marketplace around reputation broadly. But this is one project that we're working on. But really, what defines more of the work that I've been focused on has been more access to capital issues, supply chain development for companies. Really trying to ensure that they have a strong strategy in the marketplace if they're selling to small businesses. And that's what excites me, is to whatever I can do to help continue to direct and support entrepreneurs and small businesses. That's what gets me up every day.
Yeah, and you obviously cannot account for then a CEO showing up in a jumbo screen with a mistress, right? Although I would say, going back to what you were saying earlier, like all of these issues or like challenges are also opportunities. I really love the way that the company Astronomer, how they handle, how they came out after the fact and leveraging the moment. Did you see the spot they did with Gwyneth Paltrow?
And good on their executives and their investors and everyone who just mobilized to respond.
It was so great. I mean, that's like masterclass on marketing and how to leverage the way that, all attention is good attention kind of thing, right? And using that as a way to promote the product, promote like a conference that they had coming up. So I thought it was really smart on their part to do that.
Well, I mean, and you're being in the media space, I mean, this is, and social media, everything, it's such a complex environment for business owners to navigate, but I think increasingly those skill sets are important, even more with the risks around AI and better, leveraging AI to represent yourself. I just, I think this is an issue that has to be front and center for every executive now.
And speaking of AI, not that long ago, you hosted an SBA summit, like the first ever for an AI summit for small business.
That's right.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, as you've seen, I mean, small businesses have just rolled up their sleeves and figured out how to leverage AI, whether that's like ChatGPT or helping writing their campaigns, or even using the chatbots for their customer service, integrating AI into their systems. But I do think that it was happening at such a fast pace, but there's still many that have not adopted AI. And it was an interest in trying to continue this moment that happened during COVID, where small businesses finally were adopting technology at the highest rates ever. They tend to be less efficient either because either HR issues or cost of capital issues, but also technology adoption.
Yeah.
Those are three of the top reasons why they're less efficient than large businesses. And so, however I could help them continue on that trajectory of adopting technology quickly, I think, I thought would be a betterment for our economy overall.
So was the theme of the summit that is how to help small business accelerate their adoption of AI?
Right, for better efficiency, better performance. And I think in this environment where they're facing uncertainty, where they're facing high costs of capital with high interest rates, they got to be as efficient as they possibly can by any means necessary, yes.
And then there's like the impact that it creates, right? Because as we were talking about, one of the obviously with AI, you have, small business being a big driver of employment, of growth for the company. I found really interesting, I forgot, it may have been the New York Times who recently put out an article, and they were talking about that for the first time they were seeing unemployment rates at a pretty high rate relative to historical for computer science and computer engineering, higher than the arts than the arts, frankly. It was like almost like 7%. And there was the idea that because you're seeing in a lot of these companies that would normally hire these engineers and computer science graduates to be doing code, well, now you have many of these startups and companies that are leveraging AI to do some of the code for them. I was listening to a podcast a little while ago now for a Y Combinator. And in this conversation, they were talking about the whole thing around vibe coding is what they called it. This idea that basically, you have companies that are basically doing a lot of their coding through AI. And it wasn't, and they talked about as a percentage, I forgot what the number was, that it was for their portfolio of companies, somewhere like 80-something%, it was a really high number, of the code being written was being written through AI. But that wasn't so much the interesting part, because I think you kind of expect that, which, by the way, I think that's what is impacting some of these, obviously, more recent graduates to getting hired. But what was interesting is like the change or the impact it was having on the types of founders that were launching companies. So while historically they had seen almost all being technical founders, people who themselves were computer science, computer engineering, you were seeing more people that maybe came more from the product world, that were more product developers. And while they understood the engineering side, it wasn't their, being coders was not their thing. And it sort of was creating, like shifting the dynamic in terms of the type of companies, the type of opportunities. So I'm curious, what's your thought on that, on the AI side? Because I think that's maybe also part of the opportunity, is that in many ways it can level the playing field, or at least open up the aperture on the types of entrepreneurs, be in small business or whatever may be the case, that can launch companies, if that aspect of it can be supported through AI.
Yeah, no, 100%. I love anything that equalizes, levels the playing field for entrepreneurs. And the fact that you may not have to spend an exorbitant amount of money anymore to hire this whole team of engineers to do something that you envision. Instead you can leverage more AI to do it, I think is empowering. It reduces the cost of entry for that small business to be able to come into play. And then it also changes who can found a technology company today, right? And that I think should unlock more potential. People have great ideas all the time, and if they don't match with that right engineer, maybe in the dorm next to them, maybe they're at a disadvantage. But to take away some of that disadvantage and level the playing field for more, so that we can get better ideas out there, I think is fascinating. And I anytime there's evidence of that, it gives me hope, because obviously AI is here, it's coming full speed. And so when I can see that it is playing that role, that as the founders of all these AI companies insist, then I think that gives me a lot of hope for the possibilities.
And in your experience, have you seen some of that, like positive data to say, hey, these small businesses are actually be more proactively looking at AI and technology to make it more core part of what they do?
I haven't seen as much data yet on this, but but clearly, just anecdotally, and all the the tours of businesses that I've done for over the last couple of years, you see more and more companies being AI first. And I found a lot of technology startups as well, who are just leading with cybersecurity, leading with AI, whatever the case may be. They're just trying to make sure that they're on the cutting edge. Because if you don't build it in as at the base level when you're starting your company, then you're already at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the feel that most people have, which is like, we are already behind and we have to kind of catch up. And it's like, that's what's probably pushing for, on the good side, a lot of experimentation. On the bad side of it, it could also mean rolling things out. You talked about the chatbots and how responsible those things actually are and how well they're being leveraged. I mean, that's a little bit of the downside of sort of thinking about what is the right use case and also having the fail-safes, right, to be able to manage that so that you're providing the right kind of service to your customers.
And that's what's interesting is that, I do think, normal citizens, the consumers, while there may not be a government regulatory environment trying to steer AI in one direction or another, people still want responsible AI. They want to know that from an employee perspective or from an investor perspective or just from a citizen perspective that that AI is going to be used for good.
But do you think right now is a hope strategy? Like, what are we actually doing to make sure that is used for good?
Right.
Like, let's be honest. Like, what policy can we look at, point to, that is to make sure they're doing for the right thing?
I think that's the challenge, especially in such a burgeoning industry. Like, we don't, you don't want to over-regulate to limit that innovation, and it's a balance. I definitely think it's a balance, and you're seeing it in terms of the lack of job opportunities for some of these exiting coders or even the junior analysts at the private equity firms. It's just there's less opportunity.
Right. I think the opportunity is for them to launch their own company using AI rather than trying to be hired.
Create your own jobs.
I mean,
Start
that
a
could
business.
be. Let's create more jobs. There was an aspect that I hadn't really given a lot of thought about, but going back to creating responsible AI and the use cases, I was recently listening to an episode of Diary of a CEO, and he had two gentlemen in the podcast with him, and one was like in neuroscience, and they were both like basically like brain doctors, right? And one of the things that they were talking about, the use of AI, that I thought was really interesting, this idea that their concern was that the way many people were using AI, it was just making them lazier to not have to think. Sort of single prompt, write a whole paper, single prompt, do this thing that I would have normally had to spend all this time putting together. And the concern was that long term, what does that do for people's ability to have healthy brain function? And even things like different diseases that they're sort of tracking and looking at. And I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I can get it. And I have a 13-year-old daughter, so I think about it from the perspective of my 13-year-old. Is going through the hard work of putting together a presentation, writing a paper, and going through the multiple rounds of writing, editing, and the ease of just simply just doing it. And one of the ways that they tracked it, by the way, was that they had, they were doing a test where they had a certain part of a group put together this paper through AI using prompts, and another group that had to write it and kind of put it together. And then they asked both to not looking at the paper to recollect what it was that they actually written about. And of course, the group that wrote it could talk about what they wrote. The group that didn't write it, even though I'm sure they read it, I'm assuming, unless they just put the prompt and put it in there, did a terrible job in remembering or even like really being able to process what it was that they had just created. Because in essence, they didn't create. They prompted it and didn't really play an active role. Yeah. Like, that's the kind of long-term, I think, issues that we're organized as a society going to have to figure out. How do we make sure that we leverage all the benefit of this technology, but watch out for that part of it.
Yeah, well, and I think a core part of leadership as well is ability to have vision and get people to follow you and be inspired. And that means imagination and innovation. And scientists say that the part of our brain where imagination lives, where imagining the possible, managing the future, is really formed by your past experiences, what your lived experiences are, what you've done. And so I think that's a big part of deep learning, which I know they're trying to push AI to be able to be, have that human ability to analyze complex situations and pull in that instinct to form decisions. And that is our advantage. That is something that's core. But I do think foundationally, sometimes you do have to just do the hard work and the tasks to get there. And you know, I use that all the time. You know, with my team and the roles I play, I go deep on issues. I don't just rely externally on someone to feed me and tell me what it is. Like I want to be responsible in whatever it is I'm diving into, so that I can know when to push back, know when something is real or not.
Sure.
And we all have to be able to do that. And so I do think there's a risk with reliance on, over-reliance on anything.
What's your personal use case of AI? How do you use it?
Yeah, I use ChatGPT like everyone else. I haven't used it for mental counseling yet, but I know that's my fear with my children.
ChatGPT, give me a pep talk. I need it right now.
But I understand that it's really it's funny. I've in hearing about how entrepreneurs using it just as they're starting their business, like ChatGPT is not going to give you any negative feedback. They're gonna really help tell you, oh yeah, that's that. If you want to do that business plan, here's what you should think of. Yeah,
but that's part of the problem, right?
Here you go. But no, I definitely use ChatGPT on occasion to tell, find out, do some research, do some basic research. Some I haven't used it as much in writing. I like to think as I'm writing, but. It's very useful in my consulting business.
Sure. I recently was at speaking at a conference for Latino contractors that was put together by Owens Corning, and I was basically putting together a talk that is like principles of entrepreneurship that basically any kind of business can use to how to build their company, and. In doing so, of course, I was, writing my own notes. I was using ChatGPT to kind of help me with that. And I had this sort of structured conversation. And I would tell you, from using ChatGPT and my own ideas, all of the thoughts that were best flushed out were the ones where I spent the most time on them. And the ones where it was like trying to fill the gap for me, right? Like, here are 4 ideas. I'm like, oh, give me, like, what will be maybe a 5th one that I'm not thinking about right now. And I'm telling you, like, it was obvious in looking at it, it just was not, like, it was very generic. I spent a bunch of time the night before kind of, editing and modifying some of it. And I was glad to have actually spent the time doing it myself, because then, obviously, when I was speaking to it, I can speak to it with a lot more confidence and how I was saying it. But it was something that I personally use a lot more like a thought partner. And to help me kind of organize, like, I'll just dump stuff in it. Like, here's all the things that I'm thinking about, or like, what's a good way to structure this? Like, I think of it more that way, as a way to have, which is why I was surprised in that comment I was saying earlier when people were saying that that it can potentially hurt brain function. I'm like, oh, because I feel like I'm in a conversation with it. But I think that's the difference that they were making, is that when you're having it, when you're engaging with the technology as a thought partner to have conversations and to flush out ideas, is very different than do it for me. Right. And I have to think about it.
And it's dangerous if you rely on it.
100%.
We even in my consulting business, we asked for any reports that existed around small business lending. And it fed back this beautiful report on all the SBA numbers, and we're like, that doesn't look real. You just gave it to, and it's like, well, but this is what somebody who wanted this kind of information would possibly create, like it doesn't exist. This is all made up numbers.
Possibly create. I love that.
Admitted ChatGPT, and ChatGPT admitted that it.
Nice.
I'm just picking on ChatGPT, but it's all of them. I mean, across the board, we've found those kind of hallucinations do exist, and so you have to be able to use your own knowledge, your own instincts around research to be able to discern what's actual fact or fiction, and that's in our everyday world, right?
Sure.
We're having to do that more and more.
100%. Isabel, so I wanted to cover 2 more things before we wrap up, okay? So, look, you're someone, obviously, that you've had a lot of success in your career. You've had some major roles that have had a massive impact in our country and what we are. As you think about your career and some of your own lessons that you learned, and either how to manage your career, manage yourself, manage teams, what are maybe a couple of what some of the lessons could be, especially for folks that are still coming up in their career, that you think could be valuable, or things that you may have wished you would have learned a little bit earlier?
I do think that, and this is something I had the benefit of, working with an entrepreneurial dad who put me in charge of things that were probably,
By the way, as a girl dad, I love hearing that story. Okay, I'm going to tell my daughter, I'm like, hey, listen.
Yeah, and it's he'd give me responsibilities that were probably way outside my age capacity,
for him.
But he did, hiring and firing. Like I think, really being able to build a team and decide who is potentially not carrying their weight, but I think team management is something that's really a critical skill set that that any entrepreneur or any business leader needs, and it's more than just hiring the right people, but trusting and listening to your team. I walk into every meeting knowing that I should be learning something from the people around me. I'm not just I'm not looking for just yes people, or I'm not looking for to always be the one who's right in the room. Being humble, being able to recognize that you can always learn, you can always adapt, you can always pivot, and that that your team should be a safe place for being able to do that. So I think it's very challenging. And some of the most interesting stories I've heard from entrepreneurs about teams have come from veterans who really have this strong philosophy that the entire team, including the leadership, is responsible for the outcomes, right? And I do think everyone taking responsibility, but being open to each other's great ideas and what their contributions are, I think is important. But the other thing really is I do think it's less talked about, but how important it is to really carry a vision in an organization to make progress, especially quickly. When I think about government innovation or even just starting a company, usually the pace is so swift in either of those instances. I mean, you really have to think through developing culture, developing priorities, and inspiring people. So, and I think some of the skill sets that come into that, it is all the great things people talk about, the grit, the determination. But, I really think having passion and the willingness to do the very hard work, to be that subject matter expert and walk into any room prepared, I think is what gives you an advantage as a leader or 100%. Just as a contributor. My team used to joke, coming into meetings with me, just be careful. Like, she likes to get into the weeds. And it's just like, and then one of my team members says, the weeds, like she's in the roots. This was difficult, But I think it's important to, to respect people's work and, do the homework with them and go deep on subject matters. Some of that I used to think that was just me as a woman. Women are, the ones who have to be over-prepared.
I see.
Sometimes because of the challenges that, we face in the work environment. But, but I think that's just good leadership is being willing to be that over-prepared person and going the extra mile.
I think that's great advice. Last thing, which is that we've been talking the broader theme about the role of government and small business entrepreneurship innovation. What's as you look out 5-10 years, what's a prediction? What's something that you think we're gonna get to see in the next decade that could have a significant impact in how we operate?
Well, I'm an optimistic, hopeful person by nature. I think that's what makes an entrepreneur. I consider myself an entrepreneur, and you always have to be willing to think of the positive possibilities, or else you're never going to jump in and take the risk.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
And so I am, hopeful and optimistic about the future, and that I expect in 5 to 10 years, as we're even now, as we're shifting and remaking industries and remaking our whole systems in the marketplace, that entrepreneurs will continue to be the ones guiding us and coming up with new ideas, new companies, and everything else. So I'm predicting that we're going to see the entrepreneurs really take us into a new world.
I love that. Great prediction. Isabel, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
And that's it. That's a wrap.
All right. Thank you so much.
Awesome.